They did not leave because they were afraid. They left because they had counted her, and the number had come up wrong. She was 23 years old, and she was standing alone at the high shoulder of a mountain pass with a knee that had never set right. No horse, no rifle, and a wall of weather coming down out of the north that would bury the trail inside of 2 hours. Her name was Della Wren, and when she came back out of the timber dragging an armload of deadwood, the wagon was gone. Not stuck, not waiting, gone. And the tracks in the wet snow told her everything she did not want to know, because tracks do not lie the way faces do. The wheels had not panicked. The mule had not bolted. The ruts ran straight and even and unhurried toward the east, away from her, at the steady pace of people who had made up their minds long before the morning and had simply been waiting for the right excuse to send her into the trees. Here is the part nobody warns you about. The cruelest thing is not the cold that comes after. The cruelest thing is the arithmetic. Somewhere on the seat of that wagon, someone she had loved her whole life had added her up, weighed what she cost against what she gave, and decided the books would balance better without her in them. She would spend the next 4 months learning what she was actually worth, out where the numbers do not care about your feelings, and the people who threw her away would spend the rest of their lives learning that they had calculated wrong. Stay with her. Every single thing that follows, she earns. The storm came the way the bad ones always came in the San Juan Range, which is to say it did not so much arrive as change its mind about letting the day continue. One moment the light was the thin pewter of a Colorado afternoon in the back half of November, and the next, the sky to the north had gone the color of a cold forge, that low iron gray with weight behind it, and the wind had shifted around and come down off the peaks, carrying the first hard grains of snow that sting rather than settle. Della felt it in her bad knee before she felt it anywhere else. She had been working the lower branches of a stand of blue spruce for the better part of 20 minutes, snapping off the dead wood and stacking it into the canvas sling she carried slung across one shoulder, and the cold had already found the old injury, the one her stepmother referred to as the girl's bad side, the way a person refers to a cracked axle or a split board, as a flaw in the equipment. She straightened up and looked at the sky through the branches, and she knew. She had grown up reading weather the way some children grow up reading scripture, learning it because there was nothing else to do and because getting it wrong had a price. That sky meant snow, and not the soft kind that drifts down and decorates the world. That sky meant the kind that kills, that comes sideways and erases the trail and turns a mountain into a single white room with no door. "Get under cover," the sky said. "Get under cover, now." She turned and started back toward the clearing. The sling was barely half full, maybe 20 pounds of wood, nowhere near the load her stepmother Hester had demanded that morning. "Fill it to the top," Hester had said, in that flat tone that left no room in it for a person to stand. "We are not stopping again before dark, and I will not have us cold because you were slow." Della had long since stopped arguing with Hester about firewood or about anything else. Arguing with Hester was like arguing with a closed door. You could shout all you wanted, but the door did not open, and you only wore yourself out. She moved as fast as the knee would let her, which was not fast. The ground here was bad, loose rock under a thin skin of older snow, and every 4th or 5th step the leg wanted to fold under her like a thing that had quit. She had a length of pine she had picked up earlier, and she drove it into the frozen ground at each stride and used it to hold herself up, lurching along in that uneven, hitching rhythm she had stopped being ashamed of years ago. Shame was a thing you could afford when you had a roof. Out here, getting back to the wagon was the only thing on the list. She came out of the trees into the clearing where they had stopped that morning, the clearing where the wagon had been. And the wagon was not there. For a long moment she just stood and looked at the place where it should have been, the way you look at a word you have read 100 times that has suddenly stopped meaning anything. The clearing was a rough circle of maybe 60 feet, the dead grass pressed flat under frost. She could see where the wheels had rested through the morning, 2 parallel grooves worn into the cold mud. She could see the trampled patch where the mule, an old gray they called Ditch, had stood and stamped and switched its tail. She could see boot prints, dozens of them, her stepbrother's and her father's wide, heavy tread, and Hester's smaller, harder step, and one single set of smaller prints leading away from all of it into the trees. Her own. "Pa," she said. Her voice came out thinner than she had meant it to, and she did not like the sound of it, so she cleared her throat and tried again, louder, throwing it at the tree line. "Pa!" Nothing came back but the wind moving through the pass, and, somewhere off in the timber, the long creak of a fir leaning under the building snow. She walked out to the center of the clearing where the wheel ruts told their story, and she made herself look at them properly, because she had spent her whole life looking away from hard things, and she was suddenly, coldly, done with that. The mule had been backed and turned. She could read it in the tracks. Backed, swung around, and then the wagon had rolled east, deeper into the pass, away from the way they had come, away from her. The furrows were deep and clean and evenly spaced. The animal's gait had been controlled. Nobody had been fighting a frightened mule. Nobody had been swept along by anything. They had pointed the wagon away from her and walked it at a measured, deliberate pace into the storm, and they had not looked back. Because if they had looked back, they would have had to decide all over again, and they had already decided once and could not bear to do it twice. Della sat down in the snow. She did not cry, not yet. She sat on the frozen ground in the middle of that empty circle with her half-full sling of firewood across her knees, and she looked at the tracks leading east, and for a while she did not do anything at all. The wind picked up. The first fat flakes began to come down, the lazy ones that always come before the serious ones, and she watched them land on the dark wood in her lap and not melt. She made herself walk through it. Maybe the storm had spooked the animal and her father had needed to move to settle it. Maybe one of the boys, Tobias or Lemuel, had gotten hurt up ahead and they had been forced to push on to find him shelter. Maybe there was a reason, a real one. The kind of reason that would let her keep believing the thing she had believed about her father her whole life, which was that whatever else he was not a man who could leave his own daughter in the snow. She told herself all of this, and the whole time she told it, her eyes were moving over the tracks, and the tracks would not let her finish. Backed, turned, walked, even, measured. They had not run from anything. They had walked away from her on purpose, and they had taken their time about it. She thought about her father then, Eli Wren, because she had to think about him sometime, and it might as well be now while she still had the strength to. Her father was not a cruel man. She had told herself this her entire life, and she still believed most of it. He was a soft man, a quiet one, the kind who went silent when Hester spoke and went along with whatever Hester decided because going along was the easier of the two roads, and her father had always chosen the easier road. But he was not cruel. He had held her hand the night her mother died of the fever when Della was 9. He had sat up with her through that first terrible winter without her mother, feeding the stove and saying nothing because there was nothing to say. He had told her more than once, in his low, careful way, that she had her mother's eyes and her mother's quick way of seeing things, and that he counted himself lucky to have been left with so much of his wife in his only living child. She had believed all of it. She looked at the tracks, and then she let herself remember the thing she had spent 3 weeks refusing to remember. A night near the start of the journey, when she had been half asleep in the back of the wagon, wrapped in her blankets, and the voices of her father and Hester had carried back to her over the dead still air the way voices do when the world is frozen and silent. They had not known she was awake. They had not meant for her to hear. "The girl will not make it through the high pass," Hester had said. "Not on that leg. You know it as well as I do, Eli. She slows us to a crawl on the flats, and on the climbs she is dead weight, and we will all of us freeze trying to drag her over the divide. I have 3 living children to think of. She is mine by blood, and I am telling you, she is a stone in our pocket, and a person can only carry so many stones before they go under." A long silence. And then her father's voice, low and tired and beaten down the way it always was at the end of those conversations. "I will think on it." Della had told herself at the time that she had misheard. She had told herself it was only Hester being Hester, hard the way Hester was always hard, and that her father would never, that there were lines a person simply did not cross, no matter how heavy the load, no matter how cold the country. She had folded the memory up small and put it somewhere in the back of herself and refused to take it out again. She took it out now. She turned it over in the falling snow, and she looked at it, and she understood that she had not misheard a single word. She spent the first night under the low skirt of a deadfall spruce at the very edge of the timber. Getting there had taken what was left of the daylight, and by the time she had crawled in under the branches with her bundle of wood and her one good fire striker, her teeth were knocking together hard enough to hurt, and the knee had gone from a deep ache to a grinding wrongness that she had learned, over the years, to breathe through when there was nothing else to be done. She built a fire the size of her two-cupped hands. That was all she dared. A fire makes light, and light can be seen across a long way on a dark mountain, and she had no idea who or what moved through this pass in the dead of November. She ate the last food she had on her, half a corn cake from breakfast, gone so hard it nearly cost her a tooth, and a small twist of dried venison she found at the bottom of her coat pocket, which she chewed slowly and made last. It was not enough. It was nowhere close to enough. She thought about her situation the way she imagined a person ought to think about it when they found themselves in one like this, practically, without letting the fear in, because the fear would not help, and the fear would cost her warmth she could not spare. She took inventory. What did she have? One wool coat, worn through at the cuffs, but whole. Boots of decent leather, a half size too big, packed out with rag and stocking. Wool stockings, 3 layers. The canvas sling that would serve as a bag. Maybe 2 nights of firewood if she was miserly with it. The fire striker, a small folding knife she had carried in her coat pocket since she was 14 and had never once expected to need for anything more serious than cutting twine. A tin cup, no food, no water but what she could melt out of snow. What did she need? To get down out of these mountains before the deep snow came and sealed the pass for the winter. She looked up at the strip of sky she could see between the spruce boughs. The clouds were low and moving fast, and they had that loaded, heavy, settled look that meant the storm was not a passing thing, but a season arriving. She figured she had a day, maybe 2 if she was lucky, and she had not been lucky in a long time. In the morning she would follow the wagon tracks east, not because she believed her family would be at the other end of them waiting. She had already let go of that, somewhere out there in the clearing. She would follow them because east was the way out of the pass, and at the far end of the pass there might be a settlement, or a trapper's line camp, or a trading post, or a road. Or there might be nothing at all, and she would die in the trying, but she would rather die moving toward something than freeze sitting still under a tree, waiting for a wagon that was never coming back. She fed the last of the larger pieces into the small fire and pulled her knees up to her chest, the bad one protesting, and she waited for morning. She did not sleep much. The cold would not let her go deep. She kept surfacing to feed the fire or to shift the leg when it went from a dull misery to something that felt almost like a scream, and each time she came up, she was aware all over again of how dark it was, how far from any human thing, how completely she had been removed from the world of warm rooms and lit windows and people who knew your name. She thought about Tobias, who was 17 and had her own dark hair, and had taught her to whistle through her teeth when she was small, and who had watched her walk off toward the trees that morning with a look on his face she had not been able to read and was now afraid she understood. She thought about Lemuel, who was 14 and mean in the particular way of boys who have learned meanness from their mother and do not yet know they will have to spend their whole adult lives unlearning it. She thought about Hester, the exact set of that jaw, the way she had looked at Della's leg with the cool, measuring expression of a woman tallying a column of figures. She thought about her father, and then she made herself stop, because thinking about her father was the one thing that could still bring the tears up, and tears were water and warmth, and she could not spend either. The tracks were nearly gone under fresh snow by the time she set out east in the gray of morning. But she could still make out the faint depression where the wheels had cut, a long, shallow seam in the white, and she followed it as best she could, moving slow, stopping often to rest the leg against the pine staff. By midday, she had to give up the firewood. It was too heavy, and her hands were going numb trying to grip the sling, and setting it down felt like setting down the last solid thing she owned in the world. The snow was coming steadily now, not the killing blizzard yet, but a wet, relentless fall that worked down her collar and melted against her skin, and then froze again when the wind gusted. Her coat was soaked through by noon. She was soaked through by early afternoon. By late afternoon, she was no longer certain she was following the tracks at all, or whether she had wandered off the line somewhere into the trees. She stopped in a small clearing and tried to take her bearings. East was still east, she told herself. The peaks were still above her. The pass still had to end somewhere, but she could feel her body giving up its heat now in a way that an old packer had once described to her years ago when he came through her father's store back in Missouri. "You quit shivering when you are really in trouble," he had said, leaning on the counter with his coffee. "Shivering is your body putting up a fight. When the shivering stops, that is your body telling you the fight is over." She was still shivering, just barely. She started walking again. By the time the light began to fail at the end of that second day, she knew she was not going to walk out of these mountains. She understood it the way you understand a thing when you have gone all the way past panic and out the other side, clearly, without much feeling attached to it, the way you read a fact off a page. The distance was too great. The cold went too deep. The leg had gone from dragging to buckling outright every few strides, and she had fallen twice in the last hour. The second fall had taken her several long minutes to get up from. A third fall, she thought, somewhere far back in her slowing mind, might be the one she did not get up from at all. The worst of it was the way her thoughts had gone slow. She had always had a quick mind, had been quietly proud of it her whole life. Her mother had called her "my little hawk," always watching, always turning a thing over to see its underside. But her thoughts now were thick and dragging and kept circling back to nothing, like a dog too tired to do anything but turn in place. She found a hollow between two big boulders out of the worst of the wind, and she sat down against the cold stone. She was not going to build a fire. She had no wood, and even if she had, she was no longer sure her fingers could work the striker. They were past numb. They were past the place where she could feel them at all. She leaned her head back against the rock. "I do not want to die," she thought. And she thought it with a kind of mild surprise, the way you note an interesting fact that has nothing to do with you. She had been too cold and too spent and too consumed with the simple mechanics of staying alive to feel much of anything for 2 whole days, and now here it came, rising up through the gray fog of her. "I do not want to die. I am 23 years old, and I have never been anywhere or done anything that was mine, and I do not want to die in the snow because my family did the arithmetic and I came up short." The thought did not lead anywhere. She was going to die in the snow whether she wanted to or not, because the mountain did not care what she wanted. The wind had dropped. The snow was coming straight down now, thick and fast and patient, and it was settling on her shoulders and in her hair and along the tops of her boots, and some clear, cold part of her understood that if she kept sitting here, the snow would simply cover her over, and by morning she would be one more white shape that a person might mistake for a small, rounded boulder, and nobody would ever know. And then something changed. It was not a sound exactly. It was a change in the quality of the silence, the sudden absence of something, the wind, the soft hiss of the falling snow that made her aware that something in the small frozen world around her had shifted. She opened her eyes. There was a shape standing above her, between her and the snow-heavy sky. She had heard no footsteps, which meant the snow had gotten deep enough to swallow them, which meant she had been sitting here far longer than she had thought. The shape resolved itself slowly into a man. He was tall and wide across the shoulders in a way that was not fat, just bulk, the kind that comes from years of hard work in cold country. He wore a heavy coat of pieced fur, clearly made and not bought, the skins put together rough but tight. A low-pulled hat of dark felt, a rifle slung across his back, and something dead hanging from his left hand that she could not make out in the failing light. The lower half of his face was wrapped twice in a wool scarf. He was looking down at her. She looked back up at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he crouched, slow, the way a man crouches near a thing that might bolt, though she was far too frozen now to bolt anywhere. She could see his eyes above the scarf, dark, and moving over her the way a person's eyes move over something they are trying to add up. "You alive?" His voice was low and had a roughness to it like a boot on gravel. "Yes." The word came out thick and strange. Her lips were not working right. "You alone?" "Yes." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked up and around, at the trees, the boulders, the snow coming down thick and fast and final. Whatever he was reckoning, he seemed to reach the end of it. "Can you walk?" She tried to move the legs. The bad knee seized at once, and a sharp sound came out of her, not quite a cry, more the kind of punctuation mark your body throws down without asking you first. "No," she said. He looked at the leg. He looked back at her face, and then, without another word, he set down the thing in his left hand, a fox, she saw now, frozen stiff as a board, and unslung the rifle and laid it across the fox, and he got one arm under her knees and one behind her back. "This is going to hurt," he said, which was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a very long while. It did hurt. The movement of the leg sent a white bolt of pain up through her hip and spine that made the edges of her vision go dark, and she made the sound again, the one she had no say in. He did not stop, and he did not apologize. He simply stood up with her, gathered the rifle and the fox back into one hand in a single, smooth, practiced motion that told her he had carried things before that did not want to be carried, and he started walking. "Where are you taking me?" she managed. "Cabin." "How far?" "Far enough." She wanted to ask him more. "Who are you? What do you want? Is this better than dying in the snow, or only different?" But the cold had taken most of her words, and the jostling of his stride had set the knee to a steady, brutal ache that ate up what attention she had left. So she watched the snow fall past the brim of his hat, and she listened to his breathing, which was steady and even, the breathing of a man doing hard work who had done hard work all his life and expected to do more of it tomorrow. The trees moved past. The world went white and gray and then darker. "At least I am not dying in the snow," she thought. And then she thought, maybe I am only dying somewhere else. And then for a while she thought nothing at all. She came back to herself by degrees. Warmth first, a deep animal warmth she felt in her bones before she felt it on her skin, the kind you only truly understand after you have been close to freezing to death. Then smell, wood smoke and pine pitch, and something animal and something that might have been coffee or might have been boiled leather. Then sound, the close pop and settle of a good fire in a stone hearth. Then pain. Her knee a deep volcanic throb, her fingers and toes doing something between burning and tingling as the blood came back into them, which she knew was good and which felt like being held over a flame. She opened her eyes. Rough timber close overhead. She was lying on a cot or a low pallet under a heap of heavy furs. The room was small enough that she could take in most of it without lifting her head. A stone fireplace that ate most of one wall, a plank table with 2 chairs, shelves along another wall stacked with cans and dry goods and folded pelts and tools she could not name in the low light. One small window covered over with oilcloth, a gray light coming weak through it. A door, an iron stove with a pot ticking on it, traps and dried herbs, and a coil of rope hanging from the ceiling beams. And a dog. It sat 3 feet from the cot, watching her with the steady, unblinking attention that only very large dogs and very old people seem able to manage. It was enormous, some kind of mix that included a good deal of something wolf-shaped, pale gray, yellow-eyed, and wearing an expression of complete and total neutrality that was somehow more unsettling than open hostility would have been. Della and the dog regarded one another. He won't trouble you unless I tell him to." She turned her head. The man stood at the fireplace with his back to her, doing something with the pot. He had taken off the coat and the hat. His hair was dark, threaded through with gray, longer than was the fashion anywhere, pulled back rough at the nape of his neck. Even without the coat, he was a large man, broad through the shoulders and long in the arm, and she could see scarring along the side of his neck that ran down and disappeared into his collar. "What's his name?" Her voice was still thick. He glanced over his shoulder at the dog. "Bram." "Bram." She considered it. The dog's tail moved once, a single slow sweep across the floor, and went still. "That's an unusual name for a dog." "It's his name." He went back to the pot. "What's yours?" A pause, long enough that she thought he had decided not to answer. "Calder." "First or last?" "Last." "What's your first name?" Another pause, longer. "Owen. Owen Calder." "My name is Della Wren," she said. He brought a tin cup over and held it out without comment. Some kind of broth, barely anything, mostly hot water gone faintly brown, with a smell that was more useful than appealing. She tried to sit up, and her knee informed her that sitting up was no longer a thing she did casually. He watched her struggle without offering a hand. When she had finally gotten herself propped against the rough wall behind the cot, he held the cup out again. "Drink it slow." She took it in both hands. Her fingers were clumsy, not fully her own yet. The broth was thin and faintly salt, and the most welcome thing she had tasted in as long as she could remember. She drank it slow, as told. "Thank you," she said. He had already turned back to the fire. She slept again. When she woke the second time, the light through the oilcloth was brighter, which meant morning, which meant she had lost most of a day somewhere in the warmth. The fire had been built up. Bram was no longer at her side, but she could hear him, a soft shifting near the door. Owen Calder sat at the table doing something with a length of wire and a small tool. Mending a trap, she realized. His hands moved with the worn economy of a man who had done the same small task 10,000 times. She watched him a while. He was older than she had first taken him for, past 40, she thought, maybe past 45. The scarring on the neck was clearer now in the daylight, and she could see it ran up behind his left ear as well. His face, when he turned slightly to reach for something, was deeply weathered and closed in the particular way of men who have spent a great deal of time entirely alone. "How long was I out?" she said. He did not look up from the trap. "Part of yesterday. All last night." "What day is it?" "Thursday." He said it as though the name of the day were a fact of very limited use, which out here she supposed it was. "I need to—" she gestured vaguely. He set the trap down and stood. "Door's there, far corner of the porch. I'll get you to it." "I can manage." "You can't." He said it flatly, without any cruelty in it, the way a man states a thing about the weather. "You'll go down on the steps." She wanted to argue. The knee's first movement, as she shifted her weight, argued back on his behalf. He helped her to the door and out, with the brusque efficiency of a man who had assisted hurt animals before and found the process tedious but necessary. He gave her privacy. He helped her back. He did not say one word about any of it, for which she was grateful, because there is nothing in this world less dignified than needing help with the plain business of being alive, and she had very little dignity left to spend. Back on the cot, breathing through the knee and trying to gather herself into something that did not feel entirely helpless, she watched him cross to the stove and come back with a small bowl of something that was recognizably food this time. Beans, mostly, with some shredded dried meat through it. She ate it slowly, and she watched him, and she began, the way she had spent her whole life learning to do in a house where you had to read between every line a person spoke to take the measure of Owen Calder. Over the next 2 days, she pieced together what she could. He gave up nothing freely. He was a trapper. That much was plain from the pelts on every wall and the traps in every state of repair, and the heavy animal smell of the place that she was slowly growing used to. He ran lines somewhere up in the high country above the cabin. He was good at it. She could see it in the quality of the furs and the no-wasted motion way he moved through the work. He had lived here alone a long time. The cabin had the feel of a space never once arranged for more than one person, one chair angled to the fire, one cup, one plate. Everything set at a height and a reach that suited a man of his particular size and no one else. There were no photographs, no letters she could see, no small personal thing that pointed to anyone or anywhere outside these walls. Only the work of staying alive. On the second day, she learned his right knee had been hurt at some point, badly, long ago. He did not limp exactly. He had moved past limping into something else, an old accommodation, a way of placing his weight rising from a crouch, of taking the porch steps with the right leg doing less of the labor. It was not new. It was something he had lived with so long it had stopped being an injury and become simply the way he was built. She did not ask about it. She did not ask about the scars on his neck. There are some things a person hands you when they are ready and not one moment before, and grabbing for them only makes the hand close. On the third day, she tried to get up on her own to reach the tin cup down off the shelf, and she made it to standing and made it the 6 feet to the shelf and was reaching up when the knee simply quit in the middle of the motion and she went down hard. She caught at the edge of the shelf, which turned out not to be fixed to the wall as well as it might have been, and shelf and cup and 3 other things came down with her in a clatter. She sat on the floor in the wreck of it and waited for the pain to ebb to something she could think around. Owen appeared in the doorway from outside, rifle in hand, taking in the scene. She looked up at him. "I'm fine." He looked at her. He looked at the shelf, the scattered things. He looked back at her. "You're not fine," he said. "I'm sitting on the floor on purpose. It's a fashionable thing back east now. Floor sitting. Very calming." He stood the rifle against the wall. He gathered the fallen things and set the shelf back up and drove 2 more nails into it to hold it. He picked up the tin cup and put it on the table. Then he held out his hand. She took it, and he pulled her up in one smooth motion, as though she weighed nothing. "Don't do that again," he said. "Reach for my own cup?" Fall. She wanted to say she had not exactly planned on it, but he had already moved off, and she thought she understood what he meant. It was not a scolding, it was a practical concern. He had spent time and effort dragging her out of the snow, and her falling and breaking herself was a threat to that investment. She was not a person to him yet. She was a responsibility he had picked up off the ground and could not yet set down. She sat back on the cot and looked at the place where she had been and thought, "That is all right. That is no different from what I have been to everyone my whole life." But it was not entirely true, and she knew it. He had carried her out of a blizzard. He had not had to do that. By the 4th day, the knee was working well enough that she could move around the cabin carefully, and she had enough of herself back to start thinking past the next hour. She needed to understand exactly what her situation was. She waited until evening, when Owen had come in from the lines and was eating at the table, and she sat down in the other chair, the one she had caught him glancing at the first time she moved it, the way a man glances at a piece of furniture that has been in one place so long its position has become a small fact of the world. "I need to understand what this is," she said. He looked at her over his bowl with that very direct and very empty way of looking that she found unsettling and had begun to suspect he had cultivated on purpose. What is?" "This, me being here, what you expect from it, what the terms are." He set down his spoon. "Terms? You found me. You carried me here. You've been feeding me. I don't imagine that comes free of expectations." Something crossed his face. Not offense. She did not think he was a man who took easy offense, but something more like recognition. "What kind of expectations are you worried about?" "The obvious kind." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "No to that. No, you don't have them, or no, you won't act on them. No to both. You're in no shape, and you can't get out of these mountains till spring. I'm not going to add to your trouble." She studied his face. He had gone back to eating, which she had begun to learn meant he had said what he meant and felt no need to dress it up further. "All right," she said. "Then what do you need from me? Because I am not going to sit on that cot and eat your food and give nothing back. I won't do it." He looked at her a moment. "Can you cook?" Yes. Can you mend? Yes. Can you stay out of my way when I'm working? That depends on how much way you need. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the face a man makes when he is filing something away to look at later. That's the deal then, he said. You cook and mend and keep the fire. I hunt and run the lines and keep the roof on. And in spring, I leave. He nodded. In spring, you leave. All right. He went back to his food. She watched him a moment. My family left me, she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out the way a thing comes out when it has been held too long. Back in November, they sent me off into the trees for firewood, and they drove off while I was gone. My father, my stepmother, my 2 stepbrothers. They just left. He did not say anything. He also did not look away, which she noted and was grateful for because people usually looked away. I read the tracks, she said. They didn't panic. The mule didn't run off with them. It was a decision. I am telling you because I need you to know I'm not going to do anything foolish. I'm not going to try and go after them or... She stopped. I just needed to say it out loud to somebody. I haven't yet. Owen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Eat something. There's more in the pot. You didn't take enough today. It was not sympathy exactly. It was something older and plainer than sympathy. It was a thing that meant you are alive, and the alive have to keep eating. And to her own mild surprise, she found it was enough. She got up and got more from the pot, and the knee held, and she sat back down and ate. Outside, the storm had found them again, throwing snow against the oilcloth and leaning the fire over in the hearth. But inside, the fire held. The cabin was small and rough and smelled of traps and dog and wood smoke. She ate. She was alive. For now, that was the whole of it. The first full week in the cabin nearly broke her in a way the cold had not. Staying alive in the snow had its own clean logic. Keep warm, keep fed, keep moving. That she understood. What she had not braced for was the particular trial of living in close quarters with a man who said almost nothing and expected you to work out the rest on your own. Owen Calder did not explain himself. He did not explain his routines, his moods, his reasons for doing a thing in exactly the way he did it. He simply did them, in the same order, at roughly the same hours, and, if you were in the way, you learned very fast not to be. He woke before light. She knew because she would surface to the sound of the fire being stirred and the soft click of Bram's nails on the boards as the dog followed him to the door. By the time the gray came through the oilcloth, Owen was already gone, out on the lines. He came back by mid-afternoon, earlier if the weather turned, and spent the rest of the light working, on the porch or at the table, mending gear, dressing whatever the traps had given up, doing the 1,000 small jobs that keeping a far cabin standing seemed to require. He ate twice a day. He spoke rarely. He moved through the small room like a man who had been alone so long he had stopped imagining he might ever need to make room for anyone else. She watched, and she took note, and she began, carefully, to make herself useful. The first morning she could stand at the stove for any stretch, she made a proper breakfast. Not much, there was not much to work with, but she found cornmeal and salt and rendered fat and made hoe cakes on the iron griddle that had been sitting unused on a shelf. When Owen came back from a trap near the cabin and smelled food that was not broth, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at the plate she had set out. He looked at her. "Sit," she said. "They'll go cold." He sat. He ate 3 without a word. Then he said, "There's molasses, tin on the second shelf." "I saw it. I wasn't sure if you were saving it for something." "Not for anything in particular." She fetched it, and he poured a little over the last cake and ate it, and she sat across from him and ate her own and did not try to make talk, because she had already learned that talk with Owen Calder was not a thing you could force into being. It came or it did not. That morning it did not. But every cake was gone, and when he went back out, he did not say thank you, and he did not say don't bother, which she decided counted as the same thing. She spent that morning taking a real inventory of the cabin's stores, keeping it all in her head because there was no paper she could find, and she did not want to ask for any yet. What she found did not comfort her. Dried meat, venison, and something else, rabbit maybe. Cans, mostly beans and tomatoes, cornmeal and a little flour, some dried apples gone leathery, salt, which mattered more than it sounded, coffee, barely any, rendered fat, one small crock of honey in place of sugar, a very little rice. She thought about the weeks of winter still ahead. She thought about 2 people eating where there had been provision for 1. She ran the figures in her head, and the figures did not come out kind. When Owen came in that afternoon with a brace of rabbits, she said nothing about the figures. But that evening, when she made a stew with one of the rabbits and stretched it further than it wanted to go with the beans, she made sure every scrap of the meat went in, and the bones went back into the pot for the next day's broth. He noticed. She could tell by the way his eyes went to the pot and then to her, that adding up look. He said nothing. He ate. She was beginning to understand that with Owen, eating what you made was the whole of the compliment. The harder adjustment was the space itself. The cabin was built for 1 and held 2 with the grudging tolerance of a coat a size too small. There was the cot, which was his, a thing she had worked out when she saw him make up a pallet on the floor by the fire without a word about it. She had told him at once to take the cot back, and he had said he slept better on the floor, and she had known that was almost certainly not true, and had also known there was no argument to be had. There was the table with 2 chairs, used now by 2 people as it had been built to be, and there was everything else, the stove, the shelves, the work spots, all arranged in a logic that made sense for 1 body moving through a long rehearsed routine, and very little sense for 2 bodies trying to occupy the same room without forever crossing each other's path. They walked into each other 3 times that first week. The first time she was crossing from the stove, and he was coming to the shelf, and they met in the middle over a jar of salt, and she stepped back onto his foot. "Sorry," she said. He said nothing, only moved around her. The second time was worse. She had been reaching for the water bucket, and he came in suddenly from outside, the door catching the wind and swinging hard, and the surprise of it spun her around, and the bad knee gave its sharp opinion of spinning around, and she went down onto one knee with a sound she hated. He was there before she had finished going down, one hand closing on her upper arm, taking her weight. She steadied. He let go and stepped back, the way a man steps back from a thing he has touched on instinct and is not sure he should have. "I'm fine," she said, before he could look at the leg with that calculating face. "You twisted it." "I didn't twist it. I stumbled. It's different." It did not sound different. She took a breath and stood up straight and looked at him level. He was perhaps 3 feet off, and inside the cabin he seemed even larger than he had in the snow, taking up more of the room simply by being in it. "I have a bad knee," she said. "It is not going to get better. It is just the way I am. I'd be obliged if you'd stop watching it like it's about to become your problem." Something shifted in his face, not irritation, more like a man revising a thing he had assumed. "It's already my problem," he said. "If you fall and can't work." It was such a flat, honest, practical answer that she nearly laughed. Almost. "Fair," she said. "I'll be more careful." And she was more careful. She also began moving differently through the room, wider on her turns, one hand always near a shelf or a table edge, conscious of where her feet sat under her. It was not new. She had been managing the knee her whole grown life. It was only that she had slipped into carelessness in the snow, pushing through the pain rather than working with it, and now she had to relearn the careful management of herself. Owen, for his part, began doing a thing she did not notice for several days. He began moving things. Not loudly, not in any way that announced itself, but she would reach for a pot and find it had been set on a lower shelf. She would go for water and find the bucket had been shifted to a spot she could reach without the awkward stretch that had spun her around. Small changes, made without a single word, that turned moving through the cabin into a little less of a negotiation with her own body. She thought about saying something about it. She decided not to. Naming it might make him stop. The first crisis of the cabin, the one that was not about food or cold or her own bad leg, came on a gray afternoon at the end of that first week, and it came down through the chimney. She had built the fire up against a hard wind out of the north, and the draft was wrong, and she did not know yet, the way Owen knew in his sleep, exactly how the stove and the hearth behaved when the wind set from that quarter. The smoke that should have drawn up and out began instead to roll back down into the room, thin and bitter at first, and then thicker, and she was coughing before she fully understood what was happening, and the small window's oilcloth did nothing, and Bram was up and pawing at the door and making a sound low in his chest. She did the wrong thing first, which was to open the door wide for air, and the inrush of wind only pulled more smoke down the flue and into the room. She got it half closed again, eyes streaming, and crouched low where the air was better, and made herself think. The damper. She had watched Owen work the damper without ever being told what it did, a small lever on the stovepipe, and she reached up through the haze and found it and worked it, and the draft caught and reversed, and the smoke began grudgingly to climb back up the pipe where it belonged. She got the door cracked the right amount, a hand's width, and the cross-draft carried the worst of it out, and she knelt on the floor with the dog beside her and coughed until her eyes cleared. When Owen came in an hour later, the air still had a bite of smoke in it, and he stopped in the doorway and read the whole thing off the room the way he read tracks. The overbuilt fire, banked back now, the damper set right. Her face still streaked where she had wiped at her eyes. He looked at the stovepipe. He looked at her. "North wind fouls that flue," he said. "You have to set the damper before you build it up, not after." "I worked that out," she said. "About a lungful too late." "You worked it out." He hung his coat. That was all he said, but she understood by now that with Owen the absence of correction was a kind of praise, and that "I worked it out too late" was a thing he had filed away as "I worked it out." She had not waited for him. She had not sat coughing for someone to come save her. She had found the damper herself. It was a small thing. She counted it anyway. Out here, she was learning, you counted the small things, because the small things were what a life got built out of, one at a time. That night the wind held hard from the north, and the fire drew clean because she had set the damper first, and Owen sat at the table, working a strip of rawhide soft between his hands, and Bram lay stretched between the door and the cot, which she had begun to notice was a little closer to her each day, and she sat mending the heel of a wool sock by firelight with steady hands. And she thought about her father, just for a moment, the soft, easy man who had chosen the easier road, and she thought, "You decided I could not learn to do hard things." And then she set the thought down, because she had a sock to finish, and the fire to bank, and a long winter ahead of her, and she was, against every figure her family had run, still alive. The second week, the work settled into something that was not comfort, but was at least a shape. Della cooked, and she cooked well, which was perhaps the most useful thing about her in this situation, because she had a gift for making small ingredients yield more than they had any right to. She had grown up doing it in the back kitchen of her father's store, where money was always thin, and a clever woman could stretch a bag of cornmeal across a week. She understood the arithmetic of food the way some people understand numbers on a page. She drew the dried meat out into soups. She used the fat and the meal and the leathery apples in combinations that came to more than the sum of their parts. She rationed the coffee with the grim discipline of a person who knew it was not going to be replaced before May. She mended everything that needed mending, and a great deal needed it. Owen had been keeping his clothes the way a practical man alone keeps his clothes, patched just enough to be of use and no further. Sleeves missing buttons, a pair of heavy wool trousers with a knee darned so many times the darn itself was coming apart. Boot liners sewn back together with rawhide cord, which held but was poor for warmth. She worked through it in order, and each morning when he dressed, she could see him register, brief and expressionless, that something was different about how a thing fit or held. He never said, "Thank you." She had stopped expecting him to and started reading his silences instead, which were more honest. She learned the cabin the way you learn an animal, by watching it through its moods. She learned that the stove drew clean from the east and foul from the north, and she learned to set the damper for the wind before she ever built the fire up. She learned that the wood on the porch had to be turned, the wettest pieces rotated to the front of the stack to dry before they were needed, or you ended up feeding the fire green wood that hissed and smoked and gave no heat. She learned that Bram's ears went back a half-second before Owen's boots ever touched the porch steps, which gave her a small warning she found, for reasons she did not look at too closely, useful. She did not go outside alone. Owen had never made it a rule. He had never made much of anything a rule. But she understood it without being told. The snow beyond the door was serious, and the country past the cabin's small clearing was ground she did not know and could not safely cross on the bad knee. And she was honest enough with herself to accept it, even as the four walls pressed in on her in a way she did not care for. She had always been a person who needed to move, to go and see what was past the next thing. Stillness had never sat well with her, but she had learned the hard way in the snow what the country did to people who overestimated themselves, and she did not intend to learn it twice. Bram helped in his odd, unsentimental way. Sometime in that second week, the dog decided she was an acceptable presence, and he announced it by shifting his sleeping spot from the door to a place between the door and the cot, which put him in her orbit. He did not invite petting, exactly, but he did not refuse it either, and she took to talking to him in the long afternoons when Owen was gone. Not about anything, just talking, because the silence of the cabin when she was alone in it was a different silence than the one that lived in it when Owen was there, and she needed to hear a voice, even her own. One afternoon, in the middle of a one-sided account she was giving Bram of what she imagined the high country looked like in July, the dog's head came up and swung toward the door, and then Owen's boots hit the steps a full 2 minutes earlier than she had expected. She stopped mid-sentence. Bram's tail moved once. Owen came in, stamped the snow off, hung his coat, glanced at the dog, and then at her. He had clearly caught the tail end of something. "Talking to the dog," she said, before he could ask or not ask. "He won't answer." "He's a good listener," Owen hung his hat. "He listens when it suits him. Rest of the time, he's thinking about rabbits." She looked at Bram, who had gone back to his neutral face. "I can't fault him for that," she said, and something in the air of the cabin shifted, a fraction less weight in it, the closest thing to ease she had felt in the week since she had come. She filed it away and did not push it. But she thought about it that night, after the fire had burned low and Owen was on his pallet, and the dark of the cabin was broken only by the dim red glow of the coals. She thought about how strange a thing survival was, how it threw up a wall between two people, and then, slowly, without either of them deciding it, let something like a door appear in the wall. Not open, just there, the possibility of opening. She did not know what to do with that. She also did not know how to stop herself noticing things about him that had nothing to do with staying alive. The way his hands moved at his work, with the slow, sure precision of a man who had learned every skill he had from necessity rather than instruction. The way he sat with the bad knee held out at a slight angle, a habit so old he no longer knew he did it. The scar that ran down into his collar, and the smaller one at the corner of his left brow, and the fact that his nose had been broken at least once and healed a little off true, which gave his face an unevenness that somehow made it more worth looking at rather than less. She noticed these the way she noticed the cabin inventory, practically, thoroughly, without judgment. That was what she told herself. The hard conversations came slowly, in pieces, the way they always do with a guarded person. Nothing straight on, everything sideways. She learned he had come to these mountains a long time ago and had not been east of them since. Not from him saying, "I came here so many years back," but from a reference he let slip to a particular hard winter, which she placed and counted from. She learned he had built the cabin himself, or most of it, which explained its particular mix of solid bones and rough finishing. She learned Bram was 5 years old and that there had been a dog before him, which Owen mentioned exactly once and then never again. And she understood from the way he said it that the first dog's death was the kind of loss that does not get smaller with time. She did not push for more than what came. She had learned early that pushing with Owen produced not more, but less. He would go quieter, pull further back, and the door she had imagined in the wall would seal over and be a wall again. What she gave him in return for his unwilling patience was competence. That was the currency she had. Every meal better than what he would have managed alone. Every garment that came back whole instead of merely patched. Every evening the fire was right and the water already hot when he came in cold and tired off the lines. She offered it without comment and without expecting anything for it. She did not offer weakness or despair or the complicated grief of what her family had done. That she mostly kept to herself. It came out sometimes in the deep of the night when the wind was loud and the dark complete, or on the days the knee was bad enough that she could not keep pace with her own expectations of herself. On those days, she was shorter and less patient, and Owen seemed to sense it without being told, giving her more room, asking less of the shared air of the cabin. He was not a kind man, but he was not an unkind one, and she was beginning to understand that in a man like him, that distinction mattered more than almost anything. It was near the end of the second week that the family came back into the story, not in the flesh, but the way a thing comes back when you have buried it too shallow. She had been mending a tear in his lighter working coat, the long back seam that had been badly patched before and was pulling open again, and she was bent over the stitching when she said, without looking up, "Do you ever miss it, back east?" He did not answer at once. The awl moved small and precise in the leather he was working. "Some things," he said finally. "Like what?" A pause. "Better coffee." She snorted. She had not meant to. It came out before she could stop it, and then she was laughing, which she had not done in what felt like a very long time, and the laugh sounded strange in the low room, too big for it and rusty from lack of use. He looked at her, not quite smiling, watching. "Sorry," she said, getting herself back under control. "I wasn't expecting that answer." "What were you expecting?" "I don't know." "A person, a place, something that mattered." "Coffee matters," he said, "when it's good." She went back to the seam, smiling, letting herself because he had looked away again. And then, because the laugh had loosened something in her, she said the thing she had been carrying. "I think about going back sometimes. Not to them, to find out." She kept her eyes on the stitches. Whether they made it over the divide, whether the arithmetic worked out the way my stepmother promised it would, whether my father ever once looked back. Owen was quiet for a while. The awl had stopped. "And if you found out they made it," he said, "what would you do with that?" She thought about it honestly, because he had asked it honestly. "Nothing," she said. "I think I'd just want to know I crossed their minds, even once, even as a regret." She tied off the thread, harder than she needed to, which is a foolish thing to want from people who counted me as a stone in their pocket. "It's not foolish," he said. She looked up at him, surprised. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the leather in his hands. "Wanting to have crossed somebody's mind, that's not a foolish thing to want." And he did not say any more, and she understood, from the particular stillness that had come over him, that he had said it from somewhere closer to his own scar than he usually let himself stand, and that it was tied up in the 11 years and the things she had never asked about. She let it sit. She did not grab for it, but she folded the moment up and kept it because it was the first time he had reached toward her across the table instead of waiting on his own side of it. "Tell me one true thing," she said gently, "and I'll stop asking for a week." He was quiet long enough that she thought she had pushed too far. Then he said, "I had people, back east. I was not good to them when it counted." He set the awl down. "That's the one true thing. Don't spend it all in one place." And he got up and went to the stove for coffee, and she did not follow him with another question, because a deal was a deal, and because she had what she had asked for, which was more than she had any right to expect. That night she lay awake a long while, listening to the wind and to Owen's even breathing on the pallet by the fire, and she thought about the two of them. Two people who had each been a kind of stone in somebody's pocket, set down on the same cold mountain by accidents neither of them had chosen, learning the shape of each other a day at a time. She thought, "We are not friends yet, but this is the raw stuff that friends get made from." And then she thought of her father one more time, the soft, easy man on the wagon seat, and she found, to her surprise, that the thought had a little less teeth in it than it had the week before. She was building something here, crude and small and far from anywhere, but hers. Built out of the only material she had, which was the fact that she had not died when the arithmetic said she should have. The deep winter came in the third week of December, by her rough count, and it came the way real winter comes in the high timber, which is not as a peak that crests and eases, but as a thing that stacks. Each storm built on the last, compressing the old snow into a harder, denser, more treacherous layer, and the cold went from a thing you bundled against to a thing with a physical presence, a weight that leaned on the walls and crept under the door and pressed its face to the oilcloth. The world outside the cabin stopped resembling a place that people were meant to occupy, and Della, who had wintered in towns her whole life, learned what it was to live somewhere that did not want her there, and to make it anyway, day by day, a place she could survive. She had her routine now, and it held her the way the fire held the dark back, imperfectly, but enough. The early black mornings, the long quiet hours alone in the cabin while Owen ran the lines, the afternoons when he came back and the small room contracted around two people and one large dog, all trying to occupy it at once. She had learned the cabin's moods and the dog's signals and, slowly, the man's silences. There was the working silence, dense and turned inward and not aimed at her at all. There was the eating silence, which was just a man who found talk and food incompatible and would not apologize for it. And there was a third silence she had started to notice in the evenings, when the day's work was done and the fire was good and nothing was required of either of them. A silence that felt less like an absence and more like a presence, like a person standing near something without quite knowing why they had stopped walking. She did not name it. Naming it seemed the surest way to make it disappear. What she did instead was talk, in the slow, episodic way that grows up between two people who have run out of reasons to be guarded and have not yet worked out what comes after that. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her mother's narrow seamstress shop and the smell of it, hot iron and sizing starch, and the particular sweetness of new cotton off the bolt. She told him about the store and about how her father had loved it in a sincere, hopeless, unprofitable way, the way some men love things they are no good at. She told him about her mother's death, which she could do now with the flatness of a story worn smooth from so much private handling. Owen listened. He rarely asked and never prompted, but she had come to understand that this was not disinterest. It was the way he took a thing in, slowly, sitting with it rather than answering it in the moment. Days later, he would reference something she had said, which told her he had been carrying it around, turning it over the way she turned things over. "You said your mother taught you to sew," he said one evening, out of nothing, working a piece of rawhide into a new trap trigger. "Yes." "How old were you?" 5, maybe 4. It was the first useful thing she ever taught me." She paused, remembering. "She used to say the difference between a woman who sews and a woman who only makes stitches is whether she understands what the cloth wants to do, the grain of it, the way it pulls one direction and not the other. You work with it instead of fighting it, and it lies down for you. You fight it, and it fights back the whole rest of its life." Owen was quiet a moment. "That's how trapping works," he said. "You learn what the animal wants to do, where it wants to set its feet. Then you put the trap where it was already going to step." He looked at the trigger in his hands. "Most things are the same when you get down under them. I never thought of it that way. My people ran a mill," he said, and then stopped, as though surprised to hear himself say it, and she held very still, the way you hold still near a wild thing that has stepped closer than it meant to. Lumber, back in Pennsylvania. I was good at it, better than my brother, which was the trouble. He worked the rawhide a moment in silence, same as the cloth. You learn what the wood wants, where it'll split clean and where it'll fight you. I knew that mill better than I knew any person in it. And then he stopped, and she watched the door in the wall begin to close, and she did the hardest thing, which was to let it. She did not ask about the brother. She did not ask why a man who knew a mill that well had spent 11 years alone on a mountain 1,000 miles from it. She only said, she would have liked that, my mother. The idea that a seam and a trap and a board are all the same thing if you look hard enough. Smart woman, Owen said. She was. And the door stayed where it was, half closed, not sealed, and Della counted that too. The morning Owen did not come back on time, she did not worry at first. She had learned the variability of the lines by now. Some days he was back by early afternoon, some days the light was nearly gone before his boots hit the porch. She kept the fire going and finished a batch of cornbread and fed Bram and waited. But the sky had been doing something all morning that she had learned in the worst way to mistrust. That low iron gray that was not the gray of ordinary cloud, but the gray of weight, of intention. She had lifted the corner of the oilcloth twice to look at it properly. The wind had been building since noon out of the northwest, which Owen had told her once, in passing, was the quarter the worst storms came from. By late afternoon, she was standing at the window watching the tree line and doing the one kind of arithmetic she had never wanted to learn, which was how long a man could last out in country like that, in a wind like that, if something had gone wrong. By the time the light began to go, the storm had arrived in full, and Bram was at the door, where he only went when he was waiting for Owen, and Della was feeding the fire and trying not to think the thing that sat just under every other thought, which was that if Owen Calder did not come back through that door, the steps that followed were very short and very bad, and she had no idea where the lines even ran. 2 hours after full dark, Bram's head came up. Della was on her feet before she had consciously decided to move. She heard it a moment after the dog did, a sound that was wrong for the storm, a pattern in the wind that was irregular the way human movement is irregular. She grabbed the heavy coat she had been using, one of Owen's old ones, enormous on her, and pulled it on and hauled the door open. The cold hit her like a flat hand. The wind was extraordinary, the kind that takes the breath out of you before you can use it. She caught the doorframe and looked out into the black and the sideways snow, and for a moment saw nothing at all. Then she saw the shape at the foot of the porch steps. He was moving, which was the first thing that mattered. He was upright, mostly, which was the second. But he was moving wrong, listing hard to one side, one leg not tracking the way a leg should. And when the wind shifted for half a breath, she could see that his face was wrong too, drawn tight with something that had gone past cold and into pain. "Owen!" She was down the steps before she remembered the ice on them, grabbing his arm. He was heavy, far heavier than he looked, and he was putting almost none of his weight on the right leg. "What happened?" "Get inside." His voice was rough but level. "Can you walk?" "I'm walking." He was, after a fashion. She got his arm across her shoulders, and they went up the steps with him hauling on the rail and her taking what of his weight she could, which was less than she wanted, and her bad knee filed an immediate complaint that she set aside for later. They made it through the door. She kicked it shut behind them. The light inside was a shock after the dark, and she could see him properly for the first time. His right leg below the knee was dark, not the wet dark of snow. Dark, dark. "Sit down," she said. "It's not sit down, Owen." Something in her voice, some frequency she had not used before, made him sit. He lowered himself into the chair with a controlled care that told her exactly how bad it was, because Owen Calder did not do anything carefully unless he had a hard reason. She crouched in front of him and got her hands to the trouser leg, and he said, "It's not as bad as it looks." "I'd like to decide that for myself." He went quiet. She tried to roll the wool up and could not. It was frozen stiff with blood that had soaked through and set hard in the cold, so she got her knife and cut it instead, which was faster, and peeled it back and looked at what was under it. It was, in fact, about as bad as it looked. A branch, broken, jagged, the kind of point you get when a heavy snow load brings a dead limb down without any warning at all, had torn through the flesh of his lower leg on the outside, 4 inches or so above the ankle. The wound was ragged, maybe 4 inches long, shallow at the edges where the bark had skidded, and deep in the middle where the point had gone in. It had bled a great deal. It was still bleeding, slow, oozing rather than pumping, which meant it had missed anything that would have killed him quickly, but it had been bleeding long enough, and he had been in the cold long enough that the blood had frozen in layers over it instead of clotting clean. "When did this happen?" she said. 2 hours back, maybe more." "You walked on it for 2 hours?" "Didn't have another option." She looked up at him. His face was very controlled, which meant the control was costing him. There was a white edge around his mouth that she knew from watching people manage serious pain. "I have to clean it," she said, "and close it." "I know." "I need the whiskey." "Shelf above the door, behind the—" "I'll find it." She stood. "Don't move." The whiskey was where he had started to say, a bottle better than half full, which was fortune. She found the heavier thread she had been using for canvas work and the larger needle, and put water on to boil, and tore 2 of the cleanest rags she had into strips, and brought all of it back. She drew the second chair in front of his and sat and looked at the wound again, and up close in the good light it was worse, and her stomach told her so in a way she ignored. "This is going to hurt," she said, saying it because he had said it to her in the snow when he lifted her, and because she understood now why he had. "A lot." "I know that too." "Do you want something to bite?" He looked at her with an expression that was perhaps a third offended and the rest something she could not name. "Fine," she said. "Hold the chair." She cleaned it first. The whiskey went on direct, and he made a sound that was almost nothing, almost completely swallowed, but she felt the muscle of his leg go iron under her hands, and she pressed harder rather than softer, because stopping partway through is worse than going fast. "Talk," he said through his teeth. She looked up. "What?" "Talk. Say anything." She pressed the cloth to the wound and held pressure and talked. She did not afterward remember what she said. Something about the cornbread, the proportion of fat, whether they had enough meal to last. She kept her voice as level as she could while her hands did what they had to do, and he gripped the back of the chair with both hands and breathed. When it was as clean as she could get it, she looked at the edges. They wanted to pull apart. The wound was deep enough and set where any movement of the leg would open it again, that it had to be closed properly or it would never hold. She had sutured exactly twice in her life, once on a dog when she was 16, once on her own hand 2 years back when a knife slipped cutting twine. Both times she had felt the particular awful intimacy of pushing a needle through living flesh, and both times she had done it anyway, because the other choice was worse. "I have to stitch it," she said. "Figured. I've never done a thing this size, but I know how." He looked at her. In the firelight, his face was complicated, not afraid, because she had begun to believe that whatever Owen Calder felt, fear was not easily available to him, but open in a way she had not seen, as though the pain had taken down something he usually kept standing. "I believe you," he said. She had not expected that. She nearly asked him to say it again. Instead, she threaded the needle and began. She worked the way her mother had taught her to work difficult cloth, not thinking too far ahead, only the next stitch, and the one after that, pulling the ragged edges together as clean as their shape would allow. He did not make a sound. He breathed. She could feel him breathe in the small rise and fall of the leg under her hands. Now and then he would tighten on the chair back hard enough that the wood creaked, and she would feel the muscle cord under her fingers, and she would wait a beat, and then go on. Bram came and set himself against Owen's good leg and leaned there, the way a dog leans when he has understood that something is wrong and has made up his mind what to do about it, which is to be heavy and close and not move. 12 stitches. She tied off the last and sat back and looked at what she had done. It was not pretty. The edges were even enough, and the tension was right, and the spacing held, but a surgeon she was not. It would scar badly, which it would have done in any case. "It's done," she said. He looked down at it. He took a long breath in through his nose and let it out slow. "Thank you." His voice had changed. Not softer, but a layer had moved, something closer to the surface than usual. She wrapped the leg tight in the clean strips, firm enough to hold, but not so tight as to cut the blood off, and then she stood, and her own legs were unsteady in a way she had not let herself notice until just now, and she put a hand on the table and breathed for a moment. "You need to get to the cot," she said. "I'm fine in the chair." "The chair is not where a man sleeps with a wound like that. You need to be flat and you need to be warm. Don't argue with me about this." Something that might have been amusement crossed his face, barely visible under the exhaustion and the aftermath of pain. "You're different," he said. "Different from what?" "From when I found you." She picked up the bloody rags and the bottle and the needle. "You found me half frozen. Most things would be different from that." "That's not what I mean." She stopped and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she had no category for yet. Direct and considering, and more present than he usually let himself be. "You were frightened before," he said. "Not now." She thought about it. "I don't have time to be frightened right now." "No," he said. "That's not it either." She did not know what to say to that. She set the things on the shelf and went back to him and got his arm across her shoulders again and walked him to the cot. He was heavier now, the leg bearing nothing, and she had to use her hip as a brace and let it scream about it. They got him down with a kind of controlled awkwardness that did the job without either of them falling. She covered him with the two heaviest furs and laid the thinnest extra piece of wood on the fire so it would hold through the night without burning too hot. Then she pulled the second chair to the side of the cot and sat in it. "I'll stay up a while," she said, "in case the fever starts." "You don't need to, Owen." She said his name the way she would say, "Stop. Let me." He looked at the ceiling. His jaw worked, the muscle in it moving, and she could see him wrestling with a thing that was not the pain but was close to it. The particular difficulty of a self-sufficient man accepting that tonight he was not self-sufficient. "All right," he said. She sat back. The fire burned. Outside, the storm threw itself at the walls with a sound like sustained fury, and the oilcloth bowed inward with each gust, and somewhere in the timber a branch gave way with a crack she felt in her chest. Inside, the fire held. His breathing slowed and evened as exhaustion overtook the pain. Bram climbed up onto the foot of the cot, which she had never seen him do, and which she suspected violated a rule that circumstance had suspended for the night, and curled there with a heaviness that said he was staying. She sat in the chair and thought about what Owen had said. "You were frightened before, not now." She had not known it herself until he named it. She tried to find the frightened woman she had been in the snow, and she could remember her clearly, the cold and the despair and the absolute helpless smallness of it. But that woman felt oddly far off now, like a person she had been told about rather than been. She thought about what had changed. It was not that the danger was less. The wound on his leg told its own story about danger in this country. It was not that she was stronger in any one way she could point to, though her hands were rougher now and her arms had something in them they had not had before. It was something else, something to do with having been useful, truly useful, in a way that mattered. The meals that had fed them both, the clothes that kept them warm, the stitches she had just put in a man's leg that would, she believed, hold. Being needed was not the same as being loved. She knew the difference. She had spent enough of her life confusing the two. But it was something. It was a kind of mattering that did not hang on anyone's approval, or anyone's kindness, or anyone's decision to keep you around. You could keep yourself around. You could be the reason you were still there. That was what had changed. The fire settled. She banked it, careful, and pulled the coat tighter, and stayed awake in the way of someone keeping watch, not in the way of someone afraid of the dark, which she had learned was a different thing entirely. She stayed in the chair until the first gray came through the oilcloth, and then she got up and put water on and went to check the wound, and found it had held through the night, and she let out a slow breath and let herself believe, careful and without celebration, that maybe he was going to be all right. The fever came on the second day, the way she had been watching for it to. The first morning his skin had been near enough to normal that she had let herself hope, but by the second evening it was dry and hot in a way that was not good, and by the middle of that night he was sweating through the furs, and his breathing had gone shallow and labored. She kept cold cloths on his forehead through the night, wringing them out in the tin basin, pressing them back, tedious work that was probably only half effective, which she did anyway because it was the thing she could do. She changed the bandage, and the wound looked as it should, angry and swollen, but with no red lines spreading out from it, no smell that would mean the infection had truly taken hold. That was the most important something there was. Owen was not a good patient. She had not expected him to be. The first full day of fever he was mostly under, surfacing now and then into a half-wakefulness that was not really waking, saying fragments she could not assemble. A name, once, maybe two names, something about a mill, something about a brother she did not catch the whole of, only the shape of an old grief moving under the words. She did not try to answer any of it. She kept the cloth cold and the fire steady and the leg up on a folded fur, and she filed away the word brother next to the word mill and the word Pennsylvania, not to use, only because she was a person who could not help but understand things fully, and the shape of his story was coming clear to her now, even though he had never once told it straight. On the second day of fever he was awake more, which was both better and worse. Better because it meant the fever was not taking him all the way under. Worse because a half-conscious Owen Calder was still very much Owen Calder, and Owen Calder did not care to lie flat on his back being tended. "I need to check the north line," he said, the first whole sentence of that morning. She was at the stove. She turned and looked at him. "No. There's a martin set up there that you have a hole in your leg I stitched shut 2 days ago. You have a fever. You are not going anywhere." He looked at the ceiling with the face of a man already drafting his next argument. "The traps need running. The traps will keep. The animals won't. If something's caught and it freezes where it sits, then it sits frozen, and we eat it. You are not walking the north line." She brought a cup of water to the side of the cot and held it out. "Drink this." He looked at the cup. He looked at her. He drank it with the particular energy of a man doing a thing under protest and wanting that protest known. "You're stubborn," he said. "Learned it off somebody," she said. He went quiet. She thought he almost smiled. The fever broke on the third day, the way fevers do, all at once and messily. A night of heavy sweating that soaked through everything and left him pale and wrung out in the morning, but with clear eyes for the first time since the branch had taken him down. She changed the bedding and the bandage and made a thin broth from the last of the dried venison, and he drank all of it. "How much meat is left?" he said. Not really a question. She had been waiting for it. "Not much." "How much?" "Enough for 10 days if I'm careful. Less if the cold stays this hard and we burn more keeping warm." He went quiet, working the same arithmetic she had already worked. The calculating face, slow and thorough. "I need to get back on the lines," he said. "Your leg." "I know what my leg is." 2 weeks before you put full weight on it. 10 days before you go past the porch. And we do not have 2 weeks of food." "I know we don't." They looked at each other. "There's a snare," he said finally. 50 yards northeast, in the draw between the 2 big firs. Simple trigger. You could reset it. Rabbits use that draw steady, all winter." "Show me which way." "From the porch, the taller firs visible when the snow's not too thick. Draw runs along the base of it." He let out a slow breath. "And there's dried fish. Tin under the second shelf, the flat one. I forgot it was there. Not much, but it's there." She went and found it at once. 6 pieces of dried fish, hard and dark and strong-smelling. Not much, but she revised her food arithmetic upward 4 or 5 days and felt the relief of it in her body. "That helps," she said. Della. He used her name rarely enough that it still registered when he did. She looked at him. "If something happens to me," he said, "I'm not going to tell you what to do. You'll know what you need to do." "Nothing's going to happen to you." "That's not, I know what you're saying, and I'm choosing not to have that conversation today. Today you had a fever that just broke, and you need to eat and rest, and I'm going to go check the snare in the drawer, and we are going to deal with what is actually in front of us, instead of the worst version of what might be." He looked at her a long moment. "Fine," he said. "Good." She went to the snare that afternoon, in a break between snowfalls when the visibility was decent. She found the drawer where he had said, and the snare where he had said, empty but undisturbed, the trigger intact. She reset it firmer, the way he had once shown her on a piece of rope on a slow afternoon weeks back, demonstrating it without ever making a lesson of it. She found 2 more nearby that she nearly missed under a thin coat of new snow, and reset those too. She came back cold and tired and with nothing to show, and he was awake on the cot and looked at her with the same question on his face that she carried on her own. "Empty," she said, "but I reset them." He nodded. He said nothing about the fact that she had been out alone, navigating snow and bad ground on a bad knee, which she had half expected him to comment on. He seemed to have accepted, somewhere in the days of the fever, that his position relative to her capability had shifted, not in one moment, more the way snow gathers, imperceptibly, until you look up and there is more of it than you had realized. The snare stayed empty 3 days. She checked it every morning, working it into the shape of the day, and every morning came back with nothing and revised the food situation in her head and kept it to herself, because there is nothing useful to be done with worry except let it eat you. Owen healed, or healed as much as Owen was going to permit himself to heal, which meant he was upright and moving about the cabin by the 4th day after the fever, the leg holding his weight with what she could see was considerable pain, but holding. The wound, when she changed the dressing, was closing properly, the edges knitting with a solidity that meant the stitching had done its work. "It's going to be a bad scar," she said, the 6th time she changed it. "I have others." She had noticed. She did not say so. "The stitching's good," he said, to the ceiling rather than to her, in the tone of a man reporting a fact. "It's not pretty." "Doesn't need to be." On the 4th day, the deeper trouble found them, and it came on 4 legs. She had gone to the drawer to check the snare, and Owen had insisted on coming, against everything she said about it, because, he pointed out, he knew the ground and could read the sign faster than she could, and she had wanted to argue and recognized that he was right, which made arguing harder. She made him take the staff she had cut and smoothed for him while he was down, a thing halfway between a walking stick and a crutch. They went out together, the first time she had been outside with him since the night he came through the door trailing blood. The cold was extraordinary, a thing in its own category, with a texture and a weight and almost a presence. The snow was deep and crusted from a freeze and thaw that had left the surface just strong enough to suggest it would hold you and just weak enough to be wrong about half the time. Owen moved slow but steady, the staff taking what the leg could not. She matched his pace, which was easier than her own would have been, because her knee preferred even ground, and there was no even ground anywhere. The drawer was empty again. She watched him crouch, careful, favoring the leg, and study the snow around the snare with the concentrated attention he gave to things he was reading rather than only looking at. "Move it," he said. 10 feet north. There's a run here." He pointed, and she looked and saw nothing. "You can see where they've been traveling, along the base of that blowdown. The snare's set in the wrong place." "I didn't see the run." "It's faint. The snow's just barely disturbed. They move at night, when it's coldest." He straightened, slow. "Set it there. Keep the trigger light." She did it while he watched, and he said nothing, which she understood to mean she had done it right. They were heading back when Bram, who had ranged out ahead, stopped dead. The dog went rigid, Not the casual alertness of scenting something of passing interest, but the full-body stillness of an animal that has identified a particular threat. His head was up, his gaze fixed on the tree line to the west, and a low sound started in his chest that she had never heard from him. She stopped. Owen stopped. "How far is the rifle?" he said, quiet. He had left it on the porch, which now seemed like a thing of significance. 60 yards, she said, the same way. They heard them before they saw them, a sound that was almost like dogs and was not, a string of short, high vocalizations moving through the trees, coming from more than one direction. Bram's growl deepened. "Walk back," Owen said. "Don't run." "I know." They turned and walked, not fast, not slow, the deliberate pace of people who understood that running triggers pursuit and that the cabin was not near enough to make running worth anything anyway. She could hear his breathing change, the leg costing him more on the way back than on the way out, and she moved a little closer to his weak side without making a thing of it. She saw the first one at the tree line, gray and thin in the way that means real hunger, not the healthy leanness of a wolf in good country. It watched them with the patient, focused attention of an animal that had been following them longer than they had known. There were 3 more she could see, and likely more she could not. "Bram," Owen said, low and flat. The dog came to his side at once. Smart dog, she thought. This was not a fight Bram could win. The porch was 30 yards off. 20. The wolves came to the edge of the trees and stopped, which was not a comfort, because it meant they were close enough to be thinking about it. 15 yards. The lead wolf moved, not a charge, a testing motion, angling toward Owen's right side where the staff and the limp made him look like the weaker target. She saw it happen and turned into it and shouted, not words, just sound, loud and hard and as much like an animal as she could make it, and the wolf checked, startled, and pulled back. 10 yards to the porch. She got there first and had the rifle off the wall and back through the door in under 10 seconds, and Owen came through with Bram at his heels, and she put her shoulder to the door and they got it shut. For a moment, they both stood there. Her heart was going very fast. She was aware of it the way you are aware of weather, a fact occurring near you that you can note but not particularly govern. "You shouted at it," Owen said. "It worked." "It worked," he agreed. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his version of respect, which did not look like other people's versions but was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. She was already at the window, lifting the corner of the oilcloth. The wolves were at the edge of the clearing, visible in the dim gray. 5 of them, she counted twice. 5. All with the same gaunt, angular look of animals that had been crossing bad country in a bad winter with not enough to eat. "They'll come back," she said. "Yes, tonight, likely. Or they'll wait and watch." He came to stand beside her at the window. "They've been working the cabin smell a while, I'd guess. We burn the bones and scraps in the stove, but this cold carries scent differently. It travels." She thought about that, and about the snare out in the draw, and what going back to check it in the morning would look like with a pack that had now marked them as something close to prey. "We have 2 problems," she said. "The wolves and the food. If we solve one, we solve both." He said it quiet, looking out at the clearing. She understood what he meant. She looked at the wolves in the trees and thought about the meat on them and felt the particular ugliness of necessity. "Can you shoot left-handed?" she said. The wound was on his right leg, but she was thinking about a firing stance, about the stability of a compromised one. "I can shoot. It won't be my best." "It doesn't have to be your best. It has to hit the lead animal." She looked at him. "The others break if the leader goes down. That's how a pack works." He looked back at her. "You know wolves?" "I know people in groups," she said. "It's not so different. They follow the one who looks like they've decided something. Take that one away and the rest stop being a pack and go back to being 5 scared, hungry animals who'd each rather the other went first." He was quiet a moment. Then, "First light, when they're most likely to push, and we can see." "All right." She let the oilcloth fall. The cabin was very small around them, the space between them perhaps 2 feet, both of them standing at the window in the low firelight. She could feel the cold coming off his coat from the time they had spent outside. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "Going down, putting us here." He said it the way he said most things, direct, unsoftened, but there was something under it that cost more than the words. "I should have been watching the load on those limbs better." "You didn't plan to get hit by a falling branch." "I should have." "Owen," she turned toward him. "You carried me out of a blizzard. You fed me and kept me alive and asked for nothing. You do not get to apologize for getting hurt." He looked at her steadily, the firelight moving over his face, and she could see the exhaustion in it, and the pain from the leg, and the particular heaviness of a man who had been alone so long that being indebted to someone was a weight he had no idea how to carry. "You stitched me up," he said. "You sat 3 nights. Why?" The question seemed genuine, which made it the strangest thing she had been asked in a long while. She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you're still alive," she said, "and I'd like you to stay that way." He did not say anything. She went back to the stove and put water on and pretended to be very absorbed in it for a minute. The next morning came gray and still, the strange hush that comes before movement. She had been awake most of the night, and when the light began to gray the oilcloth, she lifted the corner and looked out. The lead wolf was in the clearing, alone out front, the others spread behind it in the trees. It was looking straight at the cabin with the calm, measuring look of a thing that has made up its mind. "Owen." He was already up. She had not heard him move. He took the rifle from her hands and checked it with quick automatic motions and came to the window. "Open it, 2 inches." She raised the covering 2 inches, and the cold air poured in, and somewhere outside a bird cut off mid-call. The lead wolf's head came up. Owen braced the rifle against the window frame, his right leg taking almost nothing, the left doing the work, and she could see the adjustment in how he held his body, compensating for what the leg could not give. His breathing slowed. She did not breathe at all. The shot was enormous in the morning stillness, a single hard crack that went out and bounced off the trees and came back, changed. The lead wolf dropped. The others broke instantly, gone into the timber with a speed that was almost impressive, and then the clearing was empty but for the gray shape in the snow and the echo fading into the mountain quiet. She let her breath out. Owen lowered the rifle and stood looking at the clearing with an expression she could not fully read. Not satisfaction, something more complicated. "Good shot," she said. "It was a close shot." "It was a good shot." He looked at her sideways and then back out at what lay in the snow, and she understood the complication on his face because she felt it too. The specific weight of having killed a thing because you needed to eat. The transaction that has no comfortable way to be felt. "I'll go out first," he said. "Together," she said. "Like before." He looked at her, and whatever argument he had been assembling, he set it down. Together they went out into the cold morning, and together they dragged the wolf back, which was hard and awkward, and neither of them talked much while they did it. Her knee screamed. His leg did whatever his version of screaming was, which was a locked jaw and very controlled breathing. They got it done. That night she cooked what she could of the animal and set the rest to freeze on the porch, which was more reliable than any ice house. The meat was lean and strong and not good, and they both ate it without complaint because it was the difference between the arithmetic working and not working, and they were both past needing food to be pleasant. She ate across the table from him, and he ate across from her, and Bram sat between them taking pieces from both sides, which she did not point out, and neither did he. The wolves did not come back that night, or the next. The snare caught 2 rabbits in the week that followed, and Owen was back on a shortened version of the lines inside 10 days, moving slow and not going far, but bringing back enough to keep them. The crisis had passed. Not the winter still had weeks left in it, and the food still needed careful management, and the leg would want watching longer than Owen would ever admit. But the acute thing had passed, and what it left behind was different from what had been there before. She could not have said exactly what. Only that when she looked across the cabin at him in the evenings now, Something had settled between them that had not been there, not comfortable, because neither of them was built for comfortable, but solid, the way a good stitch is solid, not beautiful, holding. It had taken near disaster to show them what they had built, but it was built, and it held. Spring did not come the way a person who had never wintered in the mountains might picture it. It did not arrive as a morning when the world was suddenly soft and green and forgiving. It came in arguments, a warm afternoon followed by 2 days of hard freeze, a week of melt that turned the snow to slush, then an overnight cold that turned the slush to ice and made the porch steps lethal. It came in the sound of water moving under the snowpack before any water was visible. It came in the light, almost imperceptibly at first, a quality in the afternoon sun that was different from January's thin, watery gray, something with a little more intention in it. Della noticed it first in Bram. The dog began spending more time at the door, not in the watchful way of the worst of winter, but with a restlessness that pointed outward. He wanted to range. He wanted a world larger than the clearing. She understood the feeling. The leg had healed as well as a wound heals in the back of nowhere, imperfectly, with a scar that pulled when the weather changed and a stiffness in the mornings that Owen managed with movement rather than complaint, walking it out on the porch and back until the tissue loosened. He did not talk about it. She did not ask. They had by now developed a fluency in each other's silences that made a great deal of talk unnecessary. What filled the late winter was work of a different kind, the longer horizon kind, the planning kind. Owen began preparing his pelts for sale, and she took on the keeping of his records, such as they were, in a battered ledger that lived on the highest shelf, the notations of a man who had kept them for himself alone and never imagined another set of eyes. She reorganized it without being asked and explained the new system once, and he looked at it and said, "That's better," and went back to work, and that was the whole of that conversation. She began, in the afternoons when the light lasted, a real inventory of the cabin, not the survival kind from the first weeks, but a longer assessment of what the place needed. The chinking between the north logs had failed and wanted redoing before next winter. The second porch step had been rotting since before she came and would be genuinely dangerous in the thaw. The wood pile was lower than it should be for a comfortable year. She wrote it all in the margin of a piece of paper she found in the ledger, and she did not show it to Owen. And she told herself she was only doing it out of the habit of a person who manages things by understanding them fully, and she did not examine that reasoning too closely, because at the edge of it sat the thing she had been not thinking about all winter. In spring, you leave. She had not forgotten it. She had only put it in the part of her mind she did not visit, the way you avoid a room in a house where something difficult is stored. But March brought it back, the way it brought back the creek that had been only a sound all winter and was now visible again, first as dark water at the ice edges and then as a proper fast cold run of snowmelt. The pass would open, not for weeks yet, but it would open. And when it opened, she had an arrangement to keep, and she had also, she realized, an old question to answer, the one she had spoken aloud once over the mending and not since. The one about her father and the divide, and whether she had ever crossed his mind. It was Owen who raised the leaving, which surprised her on a morning in late March when she was at the table with her hands around a cup of real coffee, which he had produced one morning from a small tin she had not known about, with an expression as close to conspiratorial as his face could manage. He came in from checking the morning and, instead of going to his chair or to the work table, stayed standing at the stove with his back to her for an unusual length of time. She waited. "There's a wagon train comes through," he said finally, to the wall above the stove. 6 weeks out, maybe less. They take the lower pass in May, most years. I go down and trade the season's furs at the post at the junction. You could go down with them. All right, she said. You could go with them, he said again, as though she had not heard it the first time. He turned slightly, not facing her, but no longer fully turned away. I've gold set by, from good years, enough to get you set up somewhere with more than this. A town, a real house, people. She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, at nothing, wearing the carefully neutral face he wore when he was saying a thing that cost him more than the words. She understood then that he had been holding this a while, that he had been preparing it for her, The plan and the gold and the sensible transition, the way you prepare a thing for someone when you have decided that their well-being matters to you more than your own preference for how it comes out. "You want me to go," she said. "I want—" He stopped, started again. "What I want isn't the question." "It's one of them." He was quiet. She put her cup down and looked at him directly, in the way she had learned he could tolerate, which was more directly than most people could. "Owen, do you want me to go?" The silence that followed was not the working silence or the eating silence. It was the third kind, the one she had learned to recognize in the evenings, the one that felt like presence more than absence. It went on long enough that a log shifted in the fire, and Bram raised his head and lowered it again. "No," Owen said. He said it the way he said things that were true and uncomfortable, and that he had argued with himself about first. "No, but what I want doesn't—" "Stop saying that." She stood up, not dramatically, only because she needed to be standing for this. "I have spent my whole life around people who decided that what they needed mattered more than what I was worth and who I was. My stepmother told my father I was a stone in his pocket, and my father, who I believed loved me, decided that was an arithmetic he could live with. I am not doing that again. I am not letting one more person decide for me what I am worth and where I belong." Her voice stayed level. "So I am asking you directly. Do you want me to stay?" Another silence, shorter. "Yes," he said. "Then say so. Don't pack my bag and put gold in my hand and make the decision for me because you've already decided you're not worth staying for." That landed. She watched it land, a small tightening at his eyes, a shift in how he stood. She had not meant it as a weapon, but she had meant it as true, and it was, and she would not unsay it. "It's not a small thing," he said. "Staying here. It's a hard life. It doesn't get easier." "I know that. I've been living it 4 months." "It gets harder," he said. "When—" He stopped. "When what?" He looked at her with the expression she had seen only a handful of times, the one that came when he had walked himself as close to the surface as he ever went, and then stopped, because going further was country he did not have easy passage through. The scar, the 11 years, the brother, and the mill. She waited. "When you care whether someone's all right," he said. "It was easier when there was no one whose being all right was tied to mine. That's what I gave up to come here. I gave up everyone whose being all right could break me, and I built this so it couldn't happen again." He looked at his hands. "And then I dragged you out of the snow." She understood what that sentence had cost him, and she did not treat it cheap. She let it sit in the air a moment. "I know," she said more quietly. "I know it does." He looked at her for a long time. He looked at the window where the morning light was coming through real and pale gold. He looked at his hands, and then back at her. "The chinking on the north wall needs redoing," he said. She blinked. "I know, it's on a list. And the step, second from the top. I've known about that step since February." "I was thinking," he said slowly, like a man feeling his way along ground he could not see. "We could put on another room, not large. The back wall's sound and the timber's there if I start cutting in April." He paused. "More space would help." She looked at him, at this man with his scarred neck and his rebuilt knee and his 11 years of deliberate solitude and his complete inability to say a single thing he actually meant in any direct way, and she felt something warm move through her chest, and she did not try to name it or manage it. She just let it be there. "It would help," she agreed. "We should think about a proper root cellar before next fall, too. The cold storage works, but it's poor. There's a spot on the east side, ground's not too rocky." "I'll add it to the list." He nodded. He took his coffee to the table and sat. She sat across from him. They drank their coffee in the quiet that was not quite silence, never exactly silence anymore, with the creek now audible and the birds beginning to come back to the timber and Bram's occasional shift on the floor. A quiet with ease in it, the kind that belongs to two people who have been through a thing together that neither would have survived alone, and have stopped pretending otherwise. 6 weeks later, the wagon train came through the lower pass. Della stood on the porch and watched the line of canvas tops move through the valley below, small with distance, their pace unhurried in the warm spring air. 20 wagons or so, with a dust cloud behind them that meant dry ground, which meant real spring had come and meant to stay. She had known they were coming. Owen had traded word with a trapper on the south line a week back, who passed along that the train was 2 days out, and he had come home and told her in his matter-of-fact way, and then gone back to work on the addition, which was framed now, and waiting on roofing he would get at the post. She watched the wagons a while, with Bram leaning against her leg in the way he had started doing sometime in February, which still made her feel obscurely honored. She thought about the people in them, where they were going, what they hoped to find. She thought about herself 4.5 months ago in a wagon moving through a pass, believing the people on the seat ahead of her were the fixed point her whole life turned around. She thought about her father. She had done this less as the winter went on, not because it hurt less, but because she had gotten more honest with herself about the shape of it. He had loved her. She still believed that, and believed it had cost him something to do what he had done, and believed he had spent the winter carrying that cost. But love and choice were separate things. He had made his, and she had been building in the aftermath of it, the way you build a house after a flood, out of whatever is still sound, put together differently than before. She had decided, somewhere in the last weeks, what she would do about the question. She would not go looking for them. She had thought she might want to, back in December over the mending, and she had turned out to be wrong about that. The way you can be wrong about a thing until you have stood far enough away from it to see it whole. Going to find out whether she had crossed her father's mind would only put her back in the old position, waiting on the doorstep of people who had already shut the door, waiting to be told she had mattered. She did not need them to tell her she had mattered. She had spent a winter finding it out for herself, with her own hands, in a man's torn leg and a wolf's gray shape in the snow, and a fire that drew clean because she had set the damper first. The answer to the question, she understood now, was not the answer. The answer was that she had stopped needing to ask it. That was the only crossing of the divide that had ever been hers to make, and she had made it, somewhere between the wolf and the thaw, without noticing the exact morning it happened. Owen came out of the tree line carrying timber on one shoulder, with the rolling gait of a man who had done this for decades and learned to make a heavy load work with his body rather than against it. He set the timber down beside the framed addition and straightened and followed her line of sight to the valley. They watched the wagons a moment together. "You should go down," she said. "Trade the furs, get the roofing and whatever else we need." "We'll both go," he said. "You need boots. Those ones won't last another winter." She looked down at her boots, resoled twice now and held together in 3 places with rawhide and stubbornness. "I've been meaning to mention those." "I know, you didn't want to add them to the list." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was watching the wagons. But the corner of his mouth had moved. They went down to the post 2 days later, taking the mule Owen kept at a lean-to a 1/4 mile off. One of the many things about the place she was still discovering, and a sled loaded with the season's furs. The post was small and crowded with wagon train traffic, smelling of unwashed people and tobacco and fresh-cut lumber, the most noise and the most human density she had been near since November. She found it overwhelming for about 20 minutes, and then she found her footing. She negotiated the price of the furs herself, which surprised the trader and did not surprise Owen, who stood back a little and let it happen. She got a better price than his first offer and a fair price on the boots, which were better quality than she had expected to find out here, and she said so, and the trader seemed pleased to be recognized for something besides his location. She bought coffee, the good kind, cornmeal and flour and salt, and a modest, meaningful amount of dried fruit, the roofing, and, on an instinct she did not second-guess, a small pane of real glass to replace the oilcloth in the window. It was dear, and she spent up to the line Owen had told her she could, and she did not regret a cent of it. As they were loading the sled, a woman from the train came over to her, 40 or so, with the trail-weathered look of a person who had been moving for months and had made peace with it. "You're not with the train," the woman said, not quite a question. "No, I live up the mountain." The woman glanced at Owen loading timber with his systematic efficiency, then back. "Been up there long?" "Since November."
Through the whole winter? A pause. Alone? Not alone, Della said. The woman looked at her with the evaluating expression of someone weighing the shape of a situation and whether to ask further. And it was there, in that moment, that the family came back into the story for the last time. Not in the flesh, but as a thing finally set down. Because the woman said, conversationally, the way travelers trade news at a post, "We came up the eastern road, through Cordell's Crossing, hard country east of here. There was a family wintered at the crossing, came in last fall off this very pass, half-starved, lost their mule in a slide, I heard, and most of what they had. A man and his wife and 2 boys. The wife did the talking. They were trying to sell off what was left of their wagon to buy passage on west." She shook her head. "Bad luck, some people. You hear all kinds on the road." Della stood very still. A man and his wife and 2 boys, half-starved, lost their mule and most of what they had. The arithmetic, she thought. They ran the numbers and decided they could not carry the stone, and they crossed the divide without her, and the divide took the mule and the wagon and very nearly the rest of it anyway. She felt the thing she had braced all winter to feel, and found it was not what she had braced for. It was not triumph. It was not even grief, quite. It was a strange, flat quiet, the feeling of an account being closed. She had wondered whether they made it over the divide, and now she knew. They had made it, barely, and they had paid for it, and her absence had not saved them the way Hester's figures had promised it would, because the figures had never been the real problem. The real problem was a family that solved its troubles by deciding who to leave behind, and a family like that runs out of people to leave eventually. "Did they go on west?" she heard herself ask. "Far as I know, spring, when the roads opened." The woman shrugged. "Like I said, you hear all kinds." "You do," Della agreed, and she found she had nothing else she wanted to ask. Not where exactly they had gone. Not whether the man, the soft, easy man who had chosen the easier road, had ever once spoken of a daughter he had sent for firewood. The wanting to know had gone out of her, not all at once, but enough, and what was left in its place was the plain fact of it. They had crossed. They had paid. She had stopped waiting on the doorstep. 3 true things, and she could live with all of them. "It's hard country," the woman said finally, nodding up toward the mountains. "It is," Della agreed. "It's also mine." She had not planned to say it. It came out with the simple certainty of a thing she had known without knowing she knew, and she stood with it a moment after it left her, testing it, and it held. The mountain and the timber and the cold and the particular quality of the air up there, the creek and the cabin and the morning light through the oilcloth, and now, soon, through glass. It was hers in a way that had nothing to do with ownership. It was hers because she had bled for it in the particular way of a person who nearly dies somewhere and then chooses to stay, because nothing is truly yours until you have paid for it in something real. The woman nodded as though she understood that and went back toward her wagon. Owen appeared at Della's shoulder. He had heard the last of it, she thought, or enough. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." She looked once more after the woman, after the long line of wagons rolling on west toward whatever they were each chasing, the same direction her family had gone, and she felt the last thread of it go slack and fall away. Then she turned her back on the road and faced the mountain. They loaded the last of it and turned the mule toward home. The ride up was long, and she was tired from the noise of the post, and she let herself be tired without fighting it, swaying with the motion of the sled, watching the valley fall away behind and the timber close back in around the track. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the peaks, turning the high snow a color between pink and gold, the kind that only exists for about 20 minutes around that time of year in the late afternoon.
She had noticed it all winter, but had never had anyone to mention it to. Now she said, "The light on those peaks." Owen looked, held on it a moment. "March is better," he said. "Sometimes in March, when the cloud's a certain way, it goes red." "Real red?" "Real red. You'll see it." She looked at him. "Next March." He was talking about next March, plainly, without making any point of it, the way you mention a seasonal thing to someone who will be there for the season, the way you hand a person the calendar of a place that has become theirs to share. She faced forward again. "I want a garden," she said. "South side of the cabin. The sun's good there in the afternoon. We could have something growing by midsummer. Ground's hard to break up there." "I know. I'll start now. Work it in pieces." A pause. "I'll help." She nodded. "You can help." The cabin came into view through the trees as the light was going, the stone chimney first and then the walls, the framed addition standing open to the sky, waiting on its roof. Bram was on the porch, having beaten them home by a wide margin, watching their approach with his yellow eyes and his expression of complete neutrality. She got down from the sled and her new boots hit the ground solid, and the bad knee said something mild about the long day, and she told it she would sit down soon. She stood and looked at the cabin. Rough, small, in need of more work than even the list she had been keeping. Not the cabin of anyone who had ever had enough help or enough time or enough of anything but determination. Her family had run the figures on a November morning and decided she was a cost they could not carry. They had looked at her bad leg and her weight in the wagon, and they had done the arithmetic and decided the books would not balance with her in them. What they had failed to calculate was what she would become without them. And this, she thought, standing in the clearing in the last light, was the thing nobody tells you about being thrown away by the people who should have kept you. That sometimes, in the particular conditions of the right kind of hardship, with the right kind of person standing nearby, being thrown away is the thing that finally teaches you what you are made of. You find out that you can put 12 stitches in a man's leg with your hands shaking and get it right, that you can shout down a wolf with borrowed courage and make it flinch, that you can set a damper in a smoke-filled room and save your own life and not wait for anyone to come do it for you, that you can build a whole life out of the raw material of being unwanted if you are willing to put in the work. Being discarded does not decide who you are. What you build afterward does. She was not grateful for what her family had done. She was not going to perform gratitude for a pain that was real and had cost her real things. But she was standing on a mountain in new spring boots with a list of improvements for a cabin that was hers in all the ways that counted, next to a man who had said yes when it mattered, and she was going to break ground on a garden in the morning. The light on the peaks was doing something extraordinary, and she was alive in a way that had nothing to do with merely surviving. Owen had unhitched the mule and was carrying the first load inside. He paused in the doorway and looked back at her, still standing in the clearing. "You coming in?" "In a minute." He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at things he was trying to understand, not impatient, only fully. Then he went inside and left her to her minute because that was what he did, and she had long since understood it was one of the most important things about him. She stood in the clearing in the last light and let it be everything it was, the cold still holding in the shade of the trees, the creek running somewhere below, clean and constant, the peaks holding their last hour of color above the timber, the road, far down in the valley, empty now, carrying her family on west toward whatever they had earned, and carrying nothing of hers anymore. Then she turned and went inside and pulled the door shut behind her, and the fire was going and the coffee was on, and she sat down and took off her new boots and began to read through the list of what came next. There was a great deal on it. She was already looking forward to all of it.